In the late autumn of 1943, somewhere in the United States, American engineers got their hands on a small German staff car that had been captured in North Africa and shipped back across the Atlantic for one purpose. They were going to take it apart and study it. It was painted in desert tan. It had a flat, smooth underbody, an air-cooled engine in the rear, and a strange, sloping front that ended in a single curved fender. The bucket seats were comfortable. The construction was elegant. It had been designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. It was a Volkswagen Type 82, a German Kübelwagen, the small four-wheeled staff car the Wehrmacht used to move officers around the desert and across the steppes of Russia. American engineers measured every component. They timed it on slopes. They ran it through sand pits and water crossings. They compared it side by side with the small, square, painfully simple four-wheel drive utility truck that American soldiers had taken to calling the Jeep. When the verdict was finally written down, it appeared in a War Department intelligence handbook published on the 15th of March 1945, called Technical Manual E30-451, the Handbook on German Military Forces. The wording was direct. The Volkswagen, the German equivalent of the American Jeep, is inferior in every way except in the comfort of its seating accommodations. That manual was restricted. Fewer than 1,000 copies circulated, and it was not handed out to every Allied officer. But it was read by the men who needed to read it, and the verdict was clear. What that handbook could not capture was the strangest thing about the war between these two vehicles, the thing the Americans noticed during testing, and the thing the Germans had been doing in the field for almost 2 years. When German troops captured American jeeps in the Egyptian desert, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, they did not destroy them, they did not abandon them, they did not even reluctantly use them, they fought to keep them. Wehrmacht units in North Africa repainted captured jeeps with German crosses and pressed them into service so often that German vehicle inventories had to be amended to account for them. Otto Skorzeny, the most famous commando in the German army, the man who got the propaganda credit for plucking Mussolini off a mountaintop in 1943, built his most ambitious operation of the war around the requirement that his men be supplied with as many captured American jeeps as German salvage units could find. He requested 100. He received about 30. He used every one of them. A vehicle that German propaganda had publicly mocked as a toy car for an unserious nation was the same vehicle that German junior officers in the field were stealing whenever they could. And by the end of the war, the men who had used it on the losing side and the men who commanded the winning side agreed on something that has never quite settled comfortably into popular memory. This little American truck had done something nobody, including the United States Army, had quite anticipated, not because of what it was, because of what it allowed every other American weapon to do. To understand how a quarter-ton truck designed in a long weekend by a freelance engineer in a half-empty Pennsylvania drafting room became, by Eisenhower's own post-war account, one of the 4 pieces of equipment most vital to the Allied victory, we have to go back to a problem the United States Army had been quietly losing for almost 100 years, and to a long, hot stretch of American countryside in the summer of 1939. The problem the Army had been losing was a problem with mud. In August of 1939, the United States First Army held a set of maneuvers around Plattsburgh, New York, that contemporary publications described as the largest peacetime military exercise in American history to that date. About 52,000 troops took part. There were mock attacks, simulated artillery barrages, and along every dirt road in the exercise area, there were columns of horses and motorcycles trying to do what the Army had been trying to do since the 1860s. Move men and orders and small weapons across broken ground faster than the enemy could react. It was not working. The horses were too slow and ate too much. The motorcycles fell over in mud, broke their riders' legs, and could not climb a moderate hill with 2 people aboard. The Model T Ford, which the Army had used as a staff car since the First World War, was a road vehicle. Take it off the road and into a ploughed field, and it became a tractor without traction. The man watching this with the most carefully concealed alarm was a 58-year-old officer named George Catlett Marshall, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute who would, on the 1st of September 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland and the day the Plattsburgh maneuvers were winding down, take the oath of office as the new Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Marshall had served in the muddy fields of France in 1918. He had seen what mud did to men and to messages. He had been pushing for years, against an indifferent Congress and a peacetime army, for a small, fast, four-wheel drive scout vehicle that could go where horses could not, and motorcycles dared not. He had been ignored. Now Poland was burning. France would burn next, and Marshall knew it. Whatever he was going to do about the Army's mobility problem, he was going to have to do it in a hurry. On the 11th of July 1940, 2 weeks after France surrendered, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps sent specifications to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The terms were severe to the point of cruelty. The Army wanted a four-wheel drive vehicle with an empty weight no greater than 1,300 pounds, a payload of 660 pounds, a wheelbase of 75 inches, and an engine producing at least 85 foot-pounds of torque. It wanted a fold-down windshield, a speed range from 3 to 50 miles per hour, and a rear bench for 3 soldiers and a machine gun. Bids were due in 11 days. A working prototype was due in 49. Of the 135 companies that received the specifications, almost all of them threw the document in the trash. The deadline was considered a joke. Only 2 responded to the original tender. One was Willys Overland Motors of Toledo, Ohio. The other was a small, nearly bankrupt company in Butler, Pennsylvania, called the American Bantam Car Company, which had been building tiny European-style economy cars and was so close to financial collapse that its main engineering staff had already been laid off. Ford joined the competition shortly afterward, when the Army invited them in. Bantam had no engineers. It had no money. It had 11 days to submit a complete bid with blueprints, cost calculations, and supplier lists, and 49 days from acceptance to deliver a finished, drivable, fully tested vehicle. What it did have was a telephone number for a freelance engineer in Detroit, named Carl Knight Probst. Probst was 56 years old. He was the son of a country doctor from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He had been building automobiles in one form or another since the early years of the century. He was, at that moment, between jobs and short on cash. The president of Bantam called him. Probst said no. Bantam pleaded. Probst still said no. Then a man named William Knudsen, recently recruited from the presidency of General Motors to take charge of all Army procurement, intervened personally and told Probst that the country needed him. Probst got into his car and drove east on the 17th of July, 1940. By the time he walked into Bantam's nearly empty drafting room and rolled up his sleeves, he had less than a week to design a vehicle from scratch. He worked through Wednesday night. He worked through Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the 19th of July, he had completed the basic layout drawings for what would, within a year, be called the Jeep. He took Friday evening off to go to the movies. On Saturday and Sunday, he finalized the cost calculations and the supplier specifications. On Monday morning, the 22nd of July, he and the Bantam plant manager piled the documents into a car and drove them to the Quartermaster Corps Test Center at Camp Holabird on the southeast edge of Baltimore. Probst had laid out the basic design in 2 days and finished the bid package in 5. The vehicle in those drawings was not original in any individual component. The engine came from a small company called Continental, a 4-cylinder side valve unit of about 45 horsepower. The transfer case came from Spicer. The transmission came from Warne gear. The axles were modified, Studebaker Champion units supplied through Spicer. What was original was the way Probst had stitched these civilian parts together into something the Army had been asking for and not getting for 30 years. A small, 4-wheel drive, all-purpose vehicle that could be built fast, repaired anywhere, and shipped anywhere in the world. On the 23rd of September 1940, the finished prototype, the so-called Bantam reconnaissance car, was driven from Butler, Pennsylvania, to Camp Holabird, Maryland, under its own power, because Bantam could not afford to ship it. Roughly 250 miles by the roads of the day. According to multiple Bantam accounts, it pulled into the Camp Holabird gate 30 minutes before the deadline. Then a strange and unfair thing happened. The Army accepted Bantam's design, ran it through brutal testing, declared it the best candidate, and then, citing concerns that tiny Bantam could not produce vehicles in the quantities the Army would need, handed Bantam's blueprints to Willys and Ford and ordered them to produce vehicles of their own based on the same layout. The Army argued, by contract, that the drawings now belonged to the government. Karl Probst was furious, and there was nothing he could do. Willys and Ford then improved the design. Willys engineering vice president Delmar G. Roos, known as Barney, who had previously been chief engineer at Studebaker, had spent 2 years modernizing an old Whippet four-cylinder into a 60-horsepower motor that Willys called the Go Devil. Roos had run that engine flat out on a dynamometer for 100 hours without braking, where the engine he had started with had failed at 22. The Go Devil was, simply, the best small military engine in the world. The Army insisted that Willys use it on their Jeep, and that Ford use it on theirs. Ford, in turn, contributed the now iconic stamped steel grille with vertical slats that has been the visual signature of the Jeep ever since. By July of 1941, the Army had standardized everything. Willys built the vehicle as the model MB Ford built the same vehicle, with parts interchangeable down to the last bolt, as the GPW. The W in GPW stood for Willys, because Ford was producing a Willys licensed design. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission would rule that the original design honors belonged to neither of them, but to American Bantam. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, Jeeps were rolling off the lines in Toledo and Dearborn. By the time the war ended in 1945, the two factories had built about 647,000 of them between them. Willys made roughly 362,000. Ford made roughly 280,000. Bantam, the company that had invented the thing, built 2,675 before being shoved aside, and survived the war by building about 74,000 quarter-ton trailers for the Jeeps to tow. Bantam never returned to making cars. It declared bankruptcy in 1950 and was absorbed by Armco Steel 6 years later. Karl Probst never got rich from the design. He died in his Dayton, Ohio home in August 1963 at the age of 79 after a long battle with cancer. The man who in 5 days had drafted what would become America's most produced wheeled military vehicle of the war died nearly forgotten outside the small circle of Jeep enthusiasts and historians who knew what he had done. But the thing he had drawn, the strange little vehicle that 133 other companies had thought was impossible to build, was about to do something nobody had quite anticipated. The first place it did so was a stretch of desert in eastern Egypt in the summer of 1942. The Special Air Service was at that time a small, semi-official, irregular British unit founded the previous year by a Scots Guards officer named David Stirling. Stirling was 26 years old. He had attended Trinity College, Cambridge, before being sent down for an accumulation of student transgressions, and he had recently been recovering from injuries he had sustained in an experimental parachute jump that had nearly killed him. He had convinced his superiors at Middle East headquarters in Cairo, against significant resistance from officers who hated the idea of private armies, that small teams of trained men attacking German airfields by surprise could destroy more enemy aircraft on the ground than the Royal Air Force could destroy in the air. In the early months, the SAS had relied on the long-range desert group, which the SAS troopers nicknamed the Libyan Desert Taxi Service, to drive them to their targets in heavy Chevrolet trucks. The men would dismount, walk in on foot, plant explosives the SAS officer Jock Lewes had perfected for igniting parked aircraft, and walk back out. It worked, but it was slow, and as German security around the airfields tightened, it grew more dangerous. In the early summer of 1942, Stirling was given a small consignment of Jeeps, the very first to reach the SAS. He looked at them and understood immediately what they were. They were not transport. They were a weapon system. He stripped them down. He cut off windshields. He removed bumpers. He bolted Vickers K aircraft machine guns to the front and rear of each vehicle, 4 guns per Jeep, fed by 60 or 96 round-pan magazines, and capable of firing somewhere between 950 and 1,200 rounds per minute. He filled the back of each Jeep with jerry cans of fuel, water condensers, ammunition, and Lewis bombs. On the night of the 26th of July, 1942, 18 modified Jeeps under Stirling's personal command crossed about 50 miles of open desert from a forward hideout at Bir el Qusair, on the northern edge of the Qattara Depression, to a German airfield called Sidi Haneish. Sidi Haneish was where the Luftwaffe was staging the bombers and transport aircraft that supplied Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Junkers 52 transports parked there carried fuel and ammunition, without which Rommel's panzers could not move. The 18 jeeps drove onto the field in 2 columns, in a V formation, with their headlights off, navigating by the stars under the direction of an LRDG navigator named Mike Sadler. When Stirling fired a green flare, all 18 jeeps opened fire at once with 72 machine guns. They drove the length of the airfield in formation, raking parked aircraft with tracer fire. In about 15 minutes, they destroyed or damaged around 37 Axis aircraft, including the Junkers 52 transports. They lost 1 man killed at the airfield itself, Lance Bombardier John Robson, aged 21, and 1 jeep disabled. The next morning, while the surviving jeeps were withdrawing, German Stuka dive bombers caught the French SAS detachment in the open and killed the French paratrooper André Zirnheld. The remaining jeeps split into small groups and reached their hideout days later. In the 15 months between the time David Stirling first put a Vickers gun on a jeep and the day he was captured by the Germans in Tunisia in January 1943, the SAS destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa, alongside fuel dumps, supply depots, and miles of telephone line. By the regiment's own count, that figure exceeded what the Royal Air Force destroyed on the ground in the same theatre over the same period. Whether or not the comparison was strictly fair, the strategic effect was real. Junkers 52 transports lost on the ground at Sidi Haneish were transports that could not fly fuel and ammunition to Rommel's panzers a few days later in the Western Desert. Stirling himself, captured in a Tunisian wadi while sleeping, became something of a German obsession. The German press and his own British press took to calling him the Phantom Major. Recent scholarship by Gavin Mortimer suggests the nickname was coined by British war correspondents rather than personally awarded by Rommel. But in either case, Stirling was passed up the German chain of POW custody until, after several escapes, he ended up in Colditz Castle in August 1944, where he remained until liberation. What the Germans were watching in the desert that summer was something they did not have a category for, not because they did not have small vehicles. They had the Kübelwagen, the elegant Porsche-designed Volkswagen variant. They had the amphibious Schwimmwagen, which was lighter and more compact than its American counterpart, the Ford GPA. But the Kübelwagen was not the Jeep. The Kübelwagen had 2-wheel drive. It had an air-cooled engine that, while reliable, produced about 24 to 25 horsepower. It was an excellent passenger car, adapted to military service. The Jeep was a military vehicle from the first sketch. It had 4-wheel drive that could be engaged in high range on the move. It could climb steep grades. It could ford about 18 inches of water without preparation, and substantially more with the deep water fording kit the Army developed for amphibious landings. It could tow a trailer carrying nearly half its own weight. The Go Devil engine produced 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute and could run for days at full load without braking. It could be repaired by a soldier with a wrench, a hammer, and a basic mechanical understanding. The Kübelwagen, by contrast, asked more of its mechanics. When American engineers wrote, in that 1945 intelligence handbook, that the Volkswagen was inferior in every way except seating comfort, they were not sneering. They were comparing 2 design philosophies. The German philosophy was to build a beautiful, clever, finely engineered light vehicle. The American philosophy was to build a tool that any soldier could use to do any job, in any place, without waiting for permission. That is what the SAS had figured out in the desert. That is what every American unit was about to discover everywhere else. In a war that produced Sherman tanks and Liberator bombers and aircraft carriers the size of small cities, the most heavily used American vehicle was a 4-wheel drive truck that weighed less than the bumper armor of a Tiger tank. By the end of the war, an American infantry regiment was issued about 145 jeeps. A glider infantry regiment had 24. A parachute infantry regiment had 17, delivered in by glider behind enemy lines. There is no British, French, or German equivalent in the entire war, The German Army's transport doctrine, even in the late 30s, still depended substantially on horses. Germany entered the war in 1939 with about 514,000 horses on its rolls. By the opening of the Soviet campaign in 1941, that number had grown to about 750,000. By February of 1945, with German factories failing under Allied bombing, the Wehrmacht was using roughly 1.2 million horses, more than twice what it had used to invade Poland. Across the entire war, the German army employed something like 2.75 million horses, more than it had used in the First World War. The image most people carry of the German army, the image of the Panzer Division crashing across European borders in a thunder of mechanized fury, was true of a small percentage of the force at the front edge. Behind that edge, the bulk of the German army marched the way armies had marched since Caesar, on its own feet, with a horse pulling the wagon. The American Army of 1944 did not have that problem. The American Army of 1944 had jeeps. If you have a relative who served in the Second World War who drove or rode in a jeep, in any branch and any theatre, I would be honored to read their name in the comments below. The unit, the place, the year. The men who knew these vehicles are nearly all gone now. Their stories are worth keeping alive. The most important thing about the Jeep was not what it looked like or what it weighed or even what it cost, which was about $738 per unit on the first Willys contract in 1941. The most important thing about the Jeep was what American soldiers did with it once they had it. This is where the story moves into territory that the Wehrmacht of 1943 was not built to understand. Consider what one Jeep, in the hands of an ordinary American soldier with no engineering training, could become. Welded brackets on the back turned it into a stretcher carrier capable of evacuating 2 wounded men under fire. A pair of pipes mounted on the front turned it into a wire cutter that could slice through German telephone lines along the Normandy hedgerows. Steel rails laid across the floor turned it into a railway maintenance vehicle that could travel on the rails of captured French trains. A pintle mount on the back of the rear seat turned it into a heavy machine gun platform with a Browning .50 caliber. A canvas tarp and a frame turned it into a field ambulance. A heavy-duty winch on the front made it a recovery vehicle for stuck trucks. On the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, jeeps sank to their axles where the heavier trucks could not even start, and the surviving jeeps still carried wounded Marines off the beaches in numbers that the medical evacuation plans had not anticipated. On the Lido Road in the China-Burma-India theatre, jeeps carried medical supplies and ammunition up jungle trails the British had concluded were impassable, in monsoon conditions in which the alternative was a man with a stretcher and a long walk. None of these modifications were designed in Detroit or Toledo. They were designed in the field, by sergeants and corporals and privates, using welding torches and salvaged parts, and the same kind of practical American mechanical instinct that had once turned Henry Ford's Model T into 1,000 different farm tools across the Midwest in the 20s. The most extreme of those modifications was probably the airborne Jeep, the version prepared to fit underneath a glider for delivery behind enemy lines. To make a Jeep fit through the side door of an airspeed Horsa or under the nose of a General Aircraft Hamilcar, ground crews removed the windshield, the bumper ends, the hand grips, and any tools and equipment not strictly required. The lightened vehicle, lashed into the glider's deck with steel cables, weighed only a few £100 less than a standard Jeep, but it now fit. A British glider regiment in Operation Market Garden in September 1944 landed jeeps this way at Arnhem in Horsa and Hamilcar gliders, and used them to tow 6-pounder anti-tank guns into the streets where the British 1st Airborne Division would make its desperate stand at the bridge. American jeeps came in by Waco CG-4 glider with the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions across northern France, the Netherlands, and into Germany. In Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine, on the 24th of March 1945, more than 200 jeeps came in with the 194th Glider Infantry Regiment alone. Jeeps were not parachute-dropped in the Second World War. The technology to drop a vehicle of that weight under canopy did not yet exist. Their crews jumped by parachute. The jeeps came in by glider. The American war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who rode in jeeps from North Africa to Italy to France until he was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on Ie Shima, on the 18th of April 1945, wrote about the Jeep in a dispatch from North Africa dated the 4th of June 1943, later collected in his book Here Is Your War. The line is worth quoting in full. "And the Jeep, good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going. It doesn't even ride so badly after you get used to it." This is the part that the Wehrmacht of 1943 was not equipped to translate into its own military framework. Not the four-wheel drive, not the simple repair, not the air-droppable design. The fact that the men using the Jeep were, in effect, redesigning it every day, in every theatre, without permission and without supervision. The Wehrmacht did not work that way. The German Army of 1943 was an institution that prized engineering excellence delivered from above. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of metallurgy and gunnery, designed in offices in Kassel by men with doctorates. The American Army of 1943 was, in equipment terms, a far less elegant institution. But it had something the Germans did not. It had a culture in which the man holding the wrench was assumed to know something the man holding the blueprint did not, and in which improvising on official equipment was not a violation but the entire point. The Jeep was a perfect vehicle for that culture. It was simple enough that any farmer's son who had taken apart a Model A could understand its workings within hours. It was rugged enough that those same hands could not break it. And it was small enough that, fitted with the body-mounted hand grips that came standard, 6 or 8 men could lift it free of a ditch. By the autumn of 1944, this vehicle was everywhere. Patton rode in jeeps as he punched across France. Eisenhower rode in one in Normandy in the famous Signal Corps photographs. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery used a jeep alongside his Humber staff car in the field. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the eldest son of the former president, rode through the Normandy fighting in a battered jeep he had named Rough Rider, after his father's volunteer cavalry regiment in the Spanish-American War, until he died of a heart attack near Meauti on the 12th of July, 1944. Generals rode in them, privates rode in them. King George VI, who had come ashore on a DUKW amphibian to visit the Normandy beachhead 10 days after D-Day, was photographed beside them throughout the war. About 50,000 jeeps were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where Russian troops called them the Willies and used them as command vehicles for officers all the way to Berlin. It is worth pausing on the medical role for a moment, because that is the role the men who served alongside the Jeep almost always remembered first. A standard battlefield modification, used in nearly every theatre, fitted a Jeep with welded steel brackets that could carry 2 stretcher cases lying flat across the rear, with a third stretcher mounted across the hood if the casualty count was severe. The trucks of the medical units could not reach the forward foxholes. The Jeeps could. The Jeeps drove through artillery fire with red crosses painted on canvas tarps, picked up men who had been hit minutes before, and bounced them across torn ground back to the battalion aid stations where surgeons could still save them. The American died of wounds rate fell from about 8% in the First World War to about 4% in the Second. That improvement was the product of many things: sulfur drugs, plasma, penicillin from 1943 onward, forward surgical hospitals, and air evacuation. But forward casualty evacuation by Jeep was a foundational part of the chain that saved those lives. Now, what about the men on the other side of the line? In the autumn of 1944, when Hitler was planning his last desperate offensive of the war in the Ardennes, he summoned a Waffen-SS lieutenant colonel named Otto Skorzeny to his Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia. The date was the 22nd of October 1944. Skorzeny, who held the rank of SS Obersturmbannführer der Reserve and had recently been promoted, had been given the propaganda credit a year earlier for the glider raid that freed Mussolini from a hotel atop the Gran Sasso, although the operation had actually been planned and led by a Luftwaffe paratroop officer named Harold Moors. Hitler now had a more delicate task for him. Hitler wanted Skorzeny to assemble a special brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, equip them with American vehicles, and send them through the American lines in the opening hours of the Ardennes attack to seize bridges over the Meuse. cut telephone lines, redirect traffic, and create paralytic confusion in the American rear. Scorzeny took the assignment. The cover name was Operation Greif, German for Griffin. Scorzeny submitted his shopping list to the German High Command. He requested 15 captured tanks of any kind, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 American jeeps, 40 motorcycles, and 120 trucks, along with appropriate quantities of American uniforms and weapons. He was promised 20 Sherman tanks. He received about 2, only one of which was running. He received 4 scout cars, about 30 jeeps, and roughly 15 trucks. The remainder he had to make up by painting German vehicles olive drab and stenciling white stars on them. Scorzeny needed fluent English speakers for the small commando element, the so-called Einheit Stierlau, of about 150 men. He hoped for several hundred fluent speakers. Of about 2,500 volunteers screened, he found about 10 who spoke perfect American English with idiom. Another 30 or 40 spoke good English without slang. The rest were marginal. Scorzeny himself, in his post-war memoir, wrote that the result was terrifying. But what is interesting is what Scorzeny did with the jeeps he had. He did not use the German Kubelwagens his own army was producing in their tens of thousands. He used the captured American jeeps, because he and his men understood exactly what the Americans understood. The jeep would go where their own vehicles could not, and any American military police officer at a checkpoint would wave through a jeep without thinking, in a way he would not wave through anything else. The operation was a tactical failure, but a psychological success of staggering proportions. American sentries across the Ardennes front began stopping every jeep they did not recognize and demanding answers to baseball questions, the names of state capitals, and the identities of cartoon characters. General Omar Bradley was briefly detained when he correctly answered that the capital of Illinois was Springfield, because the military police officer who had stopped him thought the capital was Chicago. General Eisenhower, when intelligence officers told him that Scorzeny's commandos might be trying to assassinate him, was effectively confined to his Versailles headquarters for several days during Christmas of 1944. A handful of German commandos in stolen jeeps came closer to paralyzing the Allied chain of command than entire German divisions did in the same offensive. Roughly 18 of Scorzeny's commandos were captured in American uniforms and shot. The first 3, Manfred Pernes, Gunther Billing, and Wilhelm Schmidt, were tried at Henri-Chapelle in Belgium on the 21st of December 1944 and executed by an American firing squad on the 23rd. Most of the remaining executions took place at Henri-Chapelle in 2 further batches before the end of the month. Scorzeny himself survived the war. He surrendered in May 1945. He was tried before an American military tribunal at Dachau between the 18th of August and the 9th of September 1947 on charges of improper use of American uniforms in combat. He and 9 other officers of his brigade were acquitted, in part on the testimony of a former British Special Operations executive agent who confirmed that Allied special forces had themselves contemplated wearing enemy uniforms. Scorzeny lived another 28 years. The captured American jeep, his commando's principal infiltration vehicle, was the operational center of his most ambitious mission of the war. So none of this is the same thing as saying the jeep won the war. Plenty of vehicles helped to win the war. The Sherman tank, the Liberator bomber, the Higgins boat, the Dakota transport. Each one of them moved a piece of the Allied war machine in a way that mattered. What was different about the jeep is the verdict the Americans themselves rendered on it after they had won. In 1948, Dwight Eisenhower published his memoir of the war in Europe, called Crusade in Europe. Buried in the middle of that book is a sentence that has been quoted by every serious historian of American mechanization since. 4 other pieces of equipment that most senior officers came to regard as among the most vital to our success in Africa and Europe were the bulldozer, the jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. Curiously enough, none of these is designed for combat. That sentence is important. None of them was designed for combat. The most consequential American equipment of the Second World War, by the assessment of the man who had commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe, was not the equipment that fired the bullets. It was the equipment that put the men with the bullets where the bullets needed to be. Beginning in 1945, the United States Army Historical Division undertook a project that no other army in history had attempted on quite this scale. They had captured the surviving senior officers of the German army, and they wanted to know what those officers had thought, in real time, of the war they had just fought. Most of the work was done at two facilities in the German state of Hesse, at Allendorf and at Neustadt, under the supervision of American officers including Colonel Harold Potter and a German chief editor, the former chief of the General Staff Franz Holder. The program, called the Foreign Military Studies Series, eventually produced about 2,500 manuscripts, many of which now reside at the National Archives at College Park in Maryland. They constitute the largest single body of senior German military analysis of the war that exists anywhere in the world. In those manuscripts and in the oral discussions that surrounded them, German generals were asked about Allied air power, Allied artillery, the Sherman tank, and the broader question of why their armies had lost. They blamed Hitler. They blamed the weather. They blamed the bombing. They blamed the Russians. They rarely named the Jeep directly in their formal monographs. They did not have to. They named the consequences of it. The speed at which American units could shift weight from one sector to another. The depth at which American reconnaissance penetrated their lines before being detected. The rate at which American casualties were evacuated, treated, and in many cases returned to combat. The constant pressure American forward elements could maintain on a battered German line because supply never stopped reaching them. Every one of those things, on the ground, came down to the small four-wheel drive truck that moved everything an American battalion needed at a speed no German equivalent could match. What is documented is something more interesting. The Wehrmacht's behavior. The Germans repainted captured jeeps and pressed them into German service. They built their most ambitious commando operation of the war around them. They ran a war that, even in 1944, depended on roughly 1 million horses to move its men, supplies, and artillery. They did not have a vehicle that did what the Jeep did, and they understood by the end that this gap was structural. A German army of 1944 was a foot army with a small motorized spearhead. The American army of 1944 was the first largely motorized army in the history of human warfare, and the chassis on which that transformation rested was not a tank, it was the Jeep. In an American infantry battalion in the field, communication wire could be laid, casualties could be evacuated, reconnaissance could be conducted, and forward elements could be resupplied at the same time, because each of those tasks was being performed by a separate Jeep, moving on a separate axis. A German battalion attempting the same set of tasks had to do them sequentially, in many cases on foot or with horse-drawn carts. Every American weapon that mattered in the second half of the war, every artillery piece, every machine gun, every radio, every wounded soldier, every officer with an order, every reel of telephone wire, every can of fuel, every box of K rations, was at some point moved by the Jeep. The Jeep had not won battles. The Jeep had allowed every other American thing to win battles. That was Eisenhower's verdict, and it is the one that holds up best to the documents. The contrast between the two sides was a contrast in philosophy. The Germans had built the Kübelwagen as a finished object, a clever, comfortable, finely tuned design that did one thing, transport a small number of officers across reasonable terrain, very well. They had built about 50,000 of them. The Americans had built the Jeep as an unfinished object, a simple, repairable, modifiable platform that did one thing, get from here to there with anything you wanted to put on it, anywhere on Earth. They had built about 647,000. At peak production, the Willys plant in Toledo rolled a Jeep off the line every 80 seconds. There were enough Jeeps to give every American infantry regiment a fleet of about 145, and to send some 50,000 to the Soviets and tens of thousands to the British and the Free French and the Chinese, and to land them in gliders on Normandy and Holland and the Rhine. The German answer to mobility was a refined design produced in modest numbers by a small group of specialists. The American answer was a rough design produced in overwhelming numbers and finished in the field by the men who used it. The first answer is the answer of a culture that trusts engineers. The second is the answer of a culture that trusts everybody. Karl Probst, whose drawings made the Jeep possible, never saw it remembered properly. The American Bantam Car Company, which built the first prototype, was crushed out of business by the same army contracts it had won. David Stirling, who put a Vickers gun on a Jeep in the Egyptian desert and rewrote Special Operations forever, spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp. Ernie Pyle, who loved the Jeep more than any other piece of equipment in the United States Army, was killed by a Japanese machine gun on a small island in April 1945. Most of the original 647,000 Jeeps are scrapped now. The surviving ones are collector's items, sold at auction for tens of thousands of dollars to men whose grandfathers might have driven them out of a transport ship at Salerno or Cherbourg or Manila Bay. The Wehrmacht's behavior on the battlefield, capturing the Jeep, repainting it with German crosses, sending Skorzenny's commandos through American lines in stolen examples of it, said something the German memoirs never quite said in plain language. They could not match it. They could not match what it allowed every American soldier to do. By the end of the war, they were trying very hard to use it themselves. And the man who commanded the Allied armies in Europe, when he sat down years later to write his account of the war, listed the Jeep as one of 4 pieces of equipment most senior officers came to regard as among the most vital to the victory. None of them, he noted, was designed for combat. That sentence, more than any quote attributed to any German general in any book, is the verdict that holds. If this story gave you something you had not heard before, hit the like button. It tells the platform to put this kind of careful, sourced wartime history in front of more people who actually want it. Subscribe if you want the next one. There are more stories like this. Stories about ordinary American equipment that quietly shaped the outcome of the war in ways the textbooks rarely cover, with the names and the numbers and the inconvenient truths intact. The men who built the Jeep, drove the Jeep, and bled in the Jeep are mostly gone. The vehicle they built is the closest thing they have to a monument. And the monument is still on the road.